I'm Piers, this is Scale Up. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe. I'm going to leave some helpful links below as well. And please hit that like button. So I'm going to talk about debt. Debt is good, or debt can be good. It depends on the situation, but it's a very important part of financing. And I get asked a lot about, should I raise debt? Can I raise debt? People seem to think sometimes that it's a automatic alternative to equity, and it isn't. They're very different things. So essentially, you're going to raise debt where the cash flow of the business can support debt, or you have assets to provide security, or if you want to, you can provide personal guarantees, which will come on to the upside and downside of doing that. Equity is more where in those situations where you can't raise debt, you need to raise finance, you raise equity. And equity is for shares in the company. Your ownership goes down depending on what the valuation is and how much money you raise, and you're diluted. But with equity, the equity investor is sharing the risk with you, both upside and downside. Whereas with a debt provider, they can mitigate their risk through looking at the cash flow, but also potentially taking security over assets. Now, I'm going to come on to in a moment and describe how you use a simple mortgage so you can understand debt. And you hear this term leverage, how you can understand leverage and when it can and shouldn't be used. So let's get into the detail. You can raise debt in lots of different ways, but you've also always got to put yourself in the shoes of an investor. So what an investor wants is to provide capital, receive return, and ideally get their money back. Now, in an equity situation, they share the upside and the downside with other shareholders, whereas with debt, it's a bit different. They can structure and mitigate their risk so that even in the worst case scenario, they may get all or some of their money back. So what debt providers do, they look for a number of things. And the two critical ones are cash flow. So if you've got an established business and it's making money and there's cash flow, you can use that cash flow to service the debt, to pay the interest. And in some cases, if your business is reasonably established, to amortize the debt, which means pay it off. And then you pay the interest, pay the debt off over a period of time. And that can be structured in a variety of ways in terms of how the interest is structured, interest holidays, interest ramp-ups, the term of the debt, how much you pay off over that term. There's lots of variables and ways in which you can structure that. So there's a cash flow, that's number one. And secondly is the asset backing. Now, asset backing can be complex. They can range from merchant cash guarantee providers where they're looking at credit card receipts to people that factor your debtor book to physical assets. And increasingly, a large part of company balance sheets is made of intangible assets. So even intellectual property can be monetized. So what they're looking for is assets, so that in the worst case scenario, they are sold the assets and what's left is distributed amongst creditors and the lender gets their money back. Now, clearly, lenders don't lend money on that basis. Unscrupulous ones do, they call it loan to own, but typically lenders just want to get their money back, have an easier life. This is protecting the downside scenario. So you need cash flow or assets. Now, in some cases, a lot of entrepreneurs will find when they're growing a business that the cash flow or the assets don't quite cut it. And what will happen is they'll what's called piercing the corporate veil. They'll look beyond if you've got a limited liability company, they'll look beyond that sort of limited liability and maybe ask you to give a personal guarantee. Now, a personal guarantee, if things go wrong, means that you may end up having to sell or losing personal assets. But in some ways, there's no difference using a credit card. You hear people saying that I funded my business with my credit card, whereas a credit card is a personal liability. But think very, very long and hard about personal guarantees, because if your business doesn't work out, and lots of businesses don't, for lots of reasons that may be beyond your control, it means that the lender can come after the business assets, or in the case of a personal guarantee, your personal assets. So be very wary of giving personal guarantees. Think about that very hard. And if your business can't sustain debt, perhaps you should be looking at equity instead of debt. So why is debt good? And the way to look at this is to think of a company in a way like a property development project. Let's give a simple example. And this is why you hear the term leverage and leverage buyouts. And this is what private equity do. And you hear financial engineering. The idea is to buy something that's growing with as much debt as possible, as little equity as possible. So the check the investor actually writes is small and the debt provider writes a larger check and takes a lot of the risk. So if it grows, their return is amplified, is magnified. So let's give you an example. If you were to buy a house for £100,000 and you bought it with equity, it's cost you £100,000 so far. If you then invested £50,000 in developing the house and improving it, then you've now spent £150,000. Now, if you're lucky and you could sell that house for £200,000, it's cost you £150,000, you're selling for £200,000, you've made £50,000. But you've had to invest £150,000 to make the 50. So your return is a third, so 33%, broadly speaking. You've got to pay interest, there's other costs obviously, but let's keep this simple. Now let's use debt. Let's magnify the return. So now let's say you get a mortgage on to buy the house and you get a 50% mortgage. So now it's cost you 100. You're putting £50,000 equity in, a £50,000 loan. And let's say you find a development loan to pay for the £50,000 of improvement. So now you've loaned another £50,000. That'll be a more expensive loan because there's more risk involved in that compared to maybe the mortgage. So it will sort of dampen your return slightly. So you've now invested £50,000 equity. There's now £100,000 of debt and you've made a £50,000 profit. Now clearly there's interest and payments on the debt, but let's keep it simple. 50,000 in, 50,000 out, you made 100% return. So the return's now grown from 33% to 100% by the use of debt. And that's what leverage is. So this is why private equity firms buy companies, or in mergers and acquisitions, debt is used to buy companies because it's the same thing. So when you're looking at buying a company, you buy it for this price, you invest in it over time with debt, you service the debt, you pay down the debt, the company grows and you have ideally you can pay the debt off and cash flow, or maybe you sell that company in the future, which is what private equity does, and it magnifies your return in exactly the same way. And if you think about it where you're buying a multi-billion-pound business and putting in single-digit equity, which was possible until reasonably recently, the returns, if that company grows, can be enormous. Now, the downside of debt is, it's like an option, is that on the other side, if things go the wrong way, then it magnifies the losses. And very quickly, you'll find that your debt provider wants to know what's going on and could call in the loan. So typically in debt, you have covenants. These can be things as simple as interest cover. So you have to have a certain amount of profit to cover the interest you've got to pay. And if those two begin to move towards each other, then the lender becomes nervous and it can trip a covenant. There can be lots of different covenants. You probably don't want very simple covenants that can trigger based on things like revenue. But covenants typically are about your ability to service and pay the loan. You'll find in lots of companies that fund venture debt that they may ask for a minimum cash balance, or they want to make sure that you're raising enough equity as the business progresses to make sure that they're comfortable about the debt that's been provided and getting their money back. So in a startup, typically you use equity because the business doesn't have any assets. You're probably not willing to provide a personal guarantee, and there's definitely no cash flow because you're just starting out. Now, in some cases, you can use debt. So there's the government supported program through startup loans. I'm a non-executive director of British Business Bank, which operates startup loans. Now that's different. That's where somebody isn't able to access debt in the normal ways, and they can then apply to startup loans in the UK to receive a small loan of up to £25,000 to start a business. And that can be the difference between starting a business or not starting a business. So there are lots of places you can go and find debt. There are lots of different providers. The market's grown massively since the credit crunch. You've got the banks, you've got challenger banks, the specialist lenders, the venture debt providers, asset finance providers, sort of merchant cash, people that you can factor your debtor book. There's lots of ways in which you can raise debt finance, but it doesn't necessarily mean your company or your business is quite fit to raise debt finance. So there's no right to debt finance clearly, and sometimes you have to bite the bullet and look at taking equity finance until your business is in a position where it has the correct amount of assets or cash flow to support debt. Debt is good if you can repay the loan, or you have the assets from the lender's point of view to cover their exposure, or if you're willing to provide a personal guarantee. Now, a personal guarantee is fine. If you've got a couple of £1 million of free liquid personal assets and someone asks you to give a £25,000 personal guarantee, you probably wouldn't need it. It's an extreme example, but that's fine. If you're remortgaging, you're going to have to sell everything you own to pay back that money, if it goes wrong, then you need to think about it very, very carefully, because then it's not just involving your business, it's involving your whole family unit. So it can impact when things go wrong a much wider group of people than those just involved in your business. So take it very seriously. So the summary is, debt is good if you have the right cash flow, asset backing, you can negotiate the right debt deal, but it's a contract and you need to look at the terms very, very carefully in terms of the covenants, repayment date. And people often do is think that, debt's a free option. I'll get the debt and I'll work things out. Don't do that. Take it very, very seriously. And perhaps if that's not the right thing to do, and you know it's not really in your gut, even if someone's handing you the check or holding the check in front of you, think about raising equity. That means that potentially in the long run, you may own more of your business, because if you get debt wrong, you won't own your business.